Okay, welcome back to the third and final installment of the Autocratic Lecture for Poly 103 at Mesa, April 6, 2018, blah, blah, blah. In the last two sections of this lecture, we talked about how autocratic regimes might use or perversely abuse democratic institutions in order to prolong their own survival. But of course, all good things must come to an end. Mubarak is eventually ousted. This led to what was probably or is probably a short lived democratic moment in Egypt and might cause us to ask how democratization happens and how we might learn about it considering the end of dictatorships, right? We talked a little bit about democratization last week or the week before, I guess, the week before spring break. But as every new democracy is born, it tends to mean that some old dictatorship died. And so we might ask ourselves what it means for an autocracy to die and how that influences democratization. And this is where Geddes finds herself. So Geddes has a pretty straightforward puzzle. There was a wave of democratization in the 70s and 80s, and by extension, a de-authoritarianization that we might wish to explain. We have seen, you may remember from 2 weeks ago, that the number of democracies is steadily growing. Why? What causes all of these transitions? Geddes lists a handful of theories that might account for this sudden growth in democracies. First, she reviews the possibility that economic development causes democratization. This theory notes a correlation between prosperity and democracy, as you can see in this chart. As a country becomes more economically developed, its chances of being a democracy increases from a point where at some point of poverty, it's almost assured that a country is an autocracy, and at some point in economic development, it becomes rich enough that its probability of being democracy is almost 1. There are a number of important studies that have highlighted and considered and developed this relationship. The very first, from Seymour Lipset in 1959, notes that there is a correlation between GDP per capita and democracy. Lipset's original paper uses a number of measurement strategies and controls to demonstrate that this correlation is really robust. He tried to step on it using every possible alternative variable, and his paper and subsequent papers have generally demonstrated that it's impossible to destroy this correlation. There is definitely a strong correlation between level of economic development and the extent to which or level at which a country is a democracy. Later on, Przeworski and Lamonji established that this relationship exists for a particular reason, and here's the reason. Once countries become democracies, they are far less likely to slide back into authoritarianism if they are richer. Przeworski and Lamonji demonstrate that there is not actually a relationship between a country becoming richer and transitioning to democracy. What seems to be driving the relationship that Lipset and his subsequent followers noted is that once a country becomes a democracy, if it's rich enough, it tends not to slide back. There's like a locking in point at which a country remains a democracy. Finally, Lundgren and Poole, in a separate analysis, use slightly different measures, slightly different methods, and they verify the finding from the other direction. There's a parallel correlation between individual poverty rates and authoritarianism. The problem, Geddes argues, is that despite a number of studies confirming and examining these relationships, we don't really understand the mechanisms that cause richness or economic development to translate into democracy. It's possible that richer people are just better able to demand democracy. They aren't in the field all day, they are healthy, they are secure, they have more taxes they can withhold if they are unhappy, if we believe in Tilly. But remember Przeworski and Lamonji, this should only express itself through backsliding. So if this is true, we still kind of don't really understand when it is that rich masses are interested in asserting themselves in this way. Second, it's also possible that rich elites prefer democracy to authoritarianism for a number of reasons. Once the base of development is laid down, once you've moved on from being a poor country to being a relatively rich one, it's possible that being a capitalist elite or an oligarch in the economy is just more profitable than being a stationary bandit. And so elites abandon their autocratic roles in the government and instead take on roles in the economy that leaves the field open for Democrats. It's also possible that wealth changes values. As people get richer, they start to realize that democracy is worth it. As their lower sort of Maslow's needs are met, their drive for self actualization requires that they advocate for democracy and human rights for themselves and for the people around them. And in this case, this change of preference is social, it's cultural. Wealth changes the culture, and this social change causes there to be a yearning for democracy that's shared by the elites and the masses. Being middle class just liberalizes people. Finally, of course, it's possible that we have the causation reversed. This correlation is true, but that democracy causes development. This is another sort of Tillian view that as people have more rights, actually, I guess it's not a Tillian view, it's more of a Lockean view. The idea that people have more rights, they're more interested in investing in their own human capital, they're more willing to save, and as a result of having these property rights, having access to these institutions of democracy, we build the economy faster. So, given this, Geddes argues that even though it's probably true that economic development is somehow influencing the amount of democracy in a country or the democratic character of a country, the argument is too poorly understood for it to give us an adequate solution to the puzzle of why we experience waves of democratic or democratization and waves of democratic slides back into authoritarianism. A second theory argues that bad economic performance causes countries to switch to democracies. Once you have a country that's middle class, once you have a country that has certain expectations that the government will deliver a certain type of economic performance, a failure to deliver that performance causes people to protest for democracy. Think about China's promise to deliver growth, this year-on-year promise that they're going to be able to deliver 10% GDP growth per year, or a previous discussion of Singapore. Both of these countries legitimize authoritarian rule by pointing to the fact that they have delivered consistent growth and consistent good governance. But if those things fail, we might expect that people will protest. We have similar sets of evidence for this prospect, but once again, Geddes argues that the mechanism that leads from economic or bad economic performance into democratization is actually too poorly understood for us to consider it a solution to the puzzle of waves of democratization. Again, you might make reference to Przeworski and Lamonji's finding that there is not a correlation between transitions and economic development, but rather there's a relationship between stability and economic development. Another group of theories argues that democracies emerge when elite bargains or pacts dissolve old authoritarian governments, right? So the elites who used to run an authoritarian government get together and they decide that it's no longer feasible to run an authoritarian government, and they decide as a group of elites that they would like to transition the country into a democracy. Who does this sound like that we keep running into? Who argued that democracy emerges when elites realize that they can't manage a dictatorship? Okay, hopefully, you all thought about Olson and his stationary bandits and the fact that they democratize when they have created an economy that's too complicated for them to run through an authoritarian regime. Geddes notes that this fits the history of Latin America. You have military juntas in places like Brazil and Argentina who appear to have come to an understanding among themselves that the authoritarian regime was no longer sustainable. And so a lot of these elite pact and bargain theories come out of evidence from Latin America, particularly the southern cone of Latin America. But unfortunately, they fit poorly into Eastern Europe and Africa, where democratization movements seem to rise from mass demands for democracy that take the elites by surprise. Our previous case of Egypt is a good example of this, right? There was no elite pact that ousted Mubarak from power. This was a groundswell of support for democratization from below. A last potential theory that might explain waves of democratization involves popular revolts. This fits the history of Africa when we look at the African independence movement, when we look at South Africa, recent history in Egypt, Zimbabwe, all of these places, Kenya, that declared independence in the 1960s. The popular revolt theory or narrative seems to fit what happens in Africa. But of course, think about what we just said about the elite pacts and bargains theories. It fits poorly with Latin America and Southeast Asia, where it seems like elites had a much more leading role in determining that the country should shift from authoritarianism to democracy. Right, so what is Geddes' own theory if she has rejected these standard theories of democratization? The first thing that we need to note about Geddes' article is that even though it is called Democratization, What Do We Know After 20 Years, this really becomes an article about the typologies of authoritarian regimes. Geddes argues that autocracies are really different. They're as different, at least, as democracies are, with parliamentary rule versus presidential rule. There are different institutions that run authoritarian countries. So we might expect, it might be logical to think, that each of these authoritarian regimes has different weaknesses and thus breaks down in different ways. Geddes suggests that our theories about democratization might be wrong or imperfect or fail to gather up the right trends in democratization because we consider that the transitions from all types of autocracy should be the same. Instead, she argues we ought to consider which types of autocracy we're dealing with and look for trends within the waves of democratization. Look for the types of regimes that are collapsing and look for similarities in the way that their collapse leads or fails to lead to a democratization in that country. So given this, we should cover Geddes' typology first. She argues that there should be three types of autocracy. The first, which we've seen before, is a military dictatorship. She defines this as a group of officers that make policy decisions, and they use military hierarchies to define relationships. In particular, military dictatorships have institutions and rules that govern how different members of the military will take power over time. They have ways to transition from one government or one leader to the next, even as they maintain the military regime. The second type of autocracy that Geddes covers is a single party regime. In this case, you have a party institution which is technically separate from the government. The party institution governs secession. It decides or helps decide who will take over the mantle of the autocracy. And it also provides for some sort of division of policymaking powers such that this government has the opportunity to have dissension among the party about what sorts of policy get made so that they can handle problems and changes in the economy. I should go back one slide and say that I think we've seen a picture similar to this before. This particular military regime is the Burmese military junta, and this here, of course, is the Chinese Politburo Standing Committee. So these are people who have an institutional role in a Chinese autocracy. They can be moved in and out of power through party institutions that make them accountable to the party, not to the people. The final type of autocracy that Geddes urges us to consider is the personalist autocracy. In these cases, you have policy-making powers that are revolved around an individual person and the clique that they put together. Note that both of these men, Gaddafi on the left and Saddam Hussein on the right, have both military and party affiliation. So it is possible for these personalist regimes to wear the guise or the veneer of a military or a single party institution. But Geddes argues that the real personalist regime, it takes some judgment to tell, but the real personalist regime, in those regimes, the military and the party are ultimately adaptable and subservient to the personal cult of the individual. Okay. Moving from this, Geddes argues that each type of autocratic institution is made up of elites with different incentives. Each type of autocracy is ruled by people who have different reasons for ruling. The military, for example, tends to be a demographically diverse organization. This is true of the American military, it's true of most modern militaries. You get people from a variety of walks of life within the country who participate and rise through the ranks of the military. However, in this organization, all members buy into the idea that the military is an essential defender of the state's security. You participate in the military for long enough, you become convinced of the military's important role in society. As a result of this, the military develops what Geddes refers to as a corporate interest. The corporate interest refers to the military's ability to maintain its standing in society as a respected institution, its funding from the federal government, and its influence over the policies that matter to its ability to effectuate its security interests, right? So the military wants to remain well funded, it wants to remain well respected, and it wants to remain influential over policy, at least policy that has to do with national security. It's important to note that Geddes argues that the military's corporate interest can be met without a military regime, right? There are many contexts in which we see militaries that maintain or manage their corporate interests without being in power. The United States is a perfect example. The U.S. has a well-funded, well-respected military, despite the fact that our government is completely severed in principle from military control. This is very important to remember because it means that the military is only incentivized to be in power in an autocracy when the military senses that its corporate interest can only be met by taking over the government. Where a democracy is willing to fulfill the corporate interest of the military, it's unlikely that the military is going to be interested in governing rather than just remaining a military. We can sort of see this in the game tree that Geddes provides us. The military's factions win as long as they cooperate on strategy. She refers to this in her article as a game of the sexes sort of breakdown of a game. And what's really important is that the military sticks together. Where they lose, or where at least one faction of the military loses, is when they decide to part ways, and one of them remains in the barracks, and the other part of the institution attempts to rule the country. Okay. Geddes' view of a single party regime is substantially different. Everyone in the party opts to participate because without the party they would have no influence, right? If you don't have a party that stays together, if you don't have enough people who participate in the party to make sure that the party remains influential, then what you have is people who are powerless. This is totally different than the military. In a military regime, in principle, most of the members of the military who are participating in the autocracy could return to the barracks and they still have jobs. They still have jobs that contribute to the military's corporate interest. And as long as the military remains powerful, that corporate interest is a really important driver in society. And so what happens if the military regime loses, in air quotes, and the country democratizes, is really not that bad. But in the case of a single party, this is totally different. Geddes lays out a completely different game tree as a result. If the rival faction and the majority faction can't hammer out a bargain and they both fall out of office as a result, they both lose. Neither of them gets any sort of returns. It might be possible for the majority faction to cut out a rival faction and continue to operate, and that's what you're seeing as the 10 falls to the 9 over there in the left-hand column. But the way that Geddes lays out this game tree, it's really better for everyone if the majority and rival factions can hammer out a deal that runs the state through the single party cooperatively. I think that there's substantial room for argument about this. I think there are obviously certain times where the majority might seek to cleave off a rival faction, kick them out of the party, and then keep the spoils of governance more for themselves. But in Geddes' conception, there at least reaches a point where the majority needs its rival factions in order to maintain its office. Personalistic regimes then are in some ways similarly motivated. Everyone opts to participate because influence is better than the alternative. But in this case, there are structures in the institution of the personalistic regime that make this trade-off or make this threat of loss even worse. For example, members of the dictator's cadre know that they would be nowhere without him, and so they wish to cooperate with whatever the personalistic leader says. This desire is often reinforced because members of this cadre are hated in the community, and they would be prosecuted if they weren't in power. And this spreads not only throughout the actual administration of the personalistic regime, but oftentimes to the ethnicity or the religious group of the personalistic leader. You think about Iraq, where Saddam's people were in the minority ethnicity. You think about Rwanda, where the Tutsis were a minority group empowered by the Belgians. Similar in northern Mali and southern Libya, where the Keltamashek were empowered by the French to lord over the Songhai people. If you fall out of power, if your personalistic dictator goes away, it's not only true that you fall out of power and you have no influence over policy anymore, but it's likely that you're going to be persecuted by your own people. So the exception to this desire to cooperate is when it's possible for someone inside the regime to overthrow the personalistic dictator and replace it with their own cult of personality that they know already has an independent following and might be stronger and more consolidated than the personalistic dictatorship that exists already. Geddes doesn't provide a payoff table for personalistic dictatorships, mostly because she argues that they are the same as the single party regime payoff table, but more exaggerated. The losses in that lower right hand cell are actually deeply, deeply negative because of the fact that these members of the personalistic clique are going to be prosecuted if they fall out of power. Okay, so as a result, we probably see a different type of decline, Geddes argues, from each of these different types of autocracies. They each have different weaknesses, they each have different incentives, and so we should expect them to collapse under different pressures. Starting again with the military, Geddes argues that what we see is splits within the organization drive the military back to the barracks. In contrast, single-party systems collapse when shocks from outside the system require policies that the party isn't willing to sponsor. Personalist dictatorships, on the other hand, tend to fail when the leader dies or when there are internal coups or assassinations within the ruling party or the ruling personalists' networks cadre. So before we move on to hypotheses that Geddes derives from this, let's talk really briefly about the overall picture that she describes about each of these institutions. Okay, the military takes power when it senses that its parochial interests, its corporate interests are threatened. The military bows out early when elites sense that the wind is changing, when they sense that as military officers they would be better off turning the country back over to someone else and returning themselves to the barracks. In contrast, single parties tend to cooperate to generate policy and they rotate power. They're extremely stable. They're extremely flexible. When contexts around the stable party change, or the single party change, they cooperate, they elect new leadership from within the party in order to create policies that are more reactive to what's happening in the world around them. Personalist regimes feature similar types of cooperation to party regimes, except they're marked by periodic instability as rivals attempt to cut one another out, or as they attempt to take power from a personalistic leader that they feel might not have the base of support that's as strong as the personalistic leader thinks that it is. Okay, so from these things we might derive some hypotheses and test these. So let's take a look at what Geddes' evidence is that this different typology of autocratic regimes actually leads to different outcomes. And maybe I should take just a second before we leap into this to talk briefly about what this means in terms of the theory and the independent variables and the dependent variables. So in Geddes' theory, the independent variable is the type of autocratic regime, and the value that the independent variable can have is single party, personalist, or military. If you were to put the charts that we use sometimes in class up on the board, you would fill in every country with a different type of autocratic regime. And then the dependent variable is the type of breakdown that occurs or that tends to oust these individual regimes from power. So in this case, you have the dependent variable is the cause of the death of the autocratic regime, and the values that the dependent variable can take are things like the assassination of the leader or an exogenous shock that causes the economy to perform poorly, or a rift between ruling elite factions within the party or the military or the personalist leader's cult of personality. So we have a bunch of different types of failure that Geddes argues should correlate with the value in the independent variable, the type of regime that's ruling. Okay, so hopefully with that framework, we can move forward here into the hypotheses. One hypothesis that we might derive from Geddes' theory is just a straightforward measurement of how long these regimes survive. This test seems pretty obvious. Single-party regimes should be very durable. They should be long-lasting. Military regimes should come and go more quickly. Single-party regimes should outlast personalist regimes, both because parties survive the death of their current leaders. They have institutions that allow them to replace leaders that die in office easily, and because personalistic dictators are prone to assassination. Geddes tests this hypothesis in 3 ways. Here's a table for these tests and all the different ways that she tests them. Okay, first, she tests the straightforward average longevity since 1946 of each of these types of regimes. And what she finds is that military regimes last much less long than single-party regimes, and personalistic regimes fall somewhere in the middle. She also considers the average current age of a particular type of autocracy. So rather than counting the average age of every single autocracy that's ever existed since 1946, she looks only at the regimes that currently survive. Same thing. In fact, it's more exaggerated, it appears, right? The military regime survives only 7 years, the single-party regime 35 years. At this point, we've widened the gap. Military regimes are failing faster and faster, and single-party regimes are becoming more durable. Lastly, she considers the percentage of regimes that existed in 1946 that have survived till the present day. Very, very few military regimes survived from 1946 until Geddes started to write the article in 1998, only 11%. In comparison, 50% of single-party regimes that were created or existed in 1946 made it until almost the year 2000. Okay, a second set of tests should probably consider the correlation between the type of regime, the independent variable, whether it takes the value of personalistic, military, or single-party regime, and the ultimate source of the regime's failure. Right off the bat, very few personalist regimes survive the death of the leader. North Korea is the poster child of the 4 that survived. Anytime that a regime leader dies, they need to pick their successor, and if their successor does not take power, that means the regime has died. And North Korea is one of the few places that has managed to do this over and over again. Another hypothesis we might generate about sources of fragility is that coups should be more common in personalist regimes. In fact, over half of personalist regimes have ended in a coup or an assassination, compared with fewer than 10% of military and single-party states. This is a vast, vast difference in how these regimes end. Okay. Within the question of sources of fragility, we might ask the extent to which the economy seems to influence the death of these regimes, right? We should predict that single-party regimes will be more robust to economic downturns because they can replace their leaders and they're incentivized to stay in power. Right? This is a combination that no other value of the independent variable has. The military regime is not incentivized to stay in power as long as it makes more sense for the people to, or for the military to go back to the barracks. They're fine with just demobilizing. And the personalist regimes can't replace their leaders. So we should see a particular robustness to economic downturns on the part of single-party regimes, Geddes argues. And in fact, we do see this. One of the ways that she measures this is to take a look at the average growth rate in the years before a regime collapses. So what we see is that military regimes actually collapse. When they collapse, typically the economy is still growing. It's not growing very fast. This is looking like we're headed toward failure. But the military appears to bail as soon as anything gets janky. Personalist regimes look like they fail right as soon as any sort of recession strikes. But single-party regimes really need to be facing a deep, deep economic crisis before they collapse. Negative 4% growth on GDP from the year before is a pretty rough economic circumstance. We should also expect to see some sort of qualitative evidence that personalist regimes are more likely to fail when they fail to pay out their own loyalists during downturns, right? So when an economic downturn happens, we should see that personalist regimes fail because of internal politics, whereas the other two regimes tend to fail because there's popular demand that they leave. And we do see this, right? Geddes argues that during the 1990s, economic crises undercut the material foundations of patrimonial rule, and she's quoting other scholars who have looked at how regime change in this case happened in Africa. And this is especially true in Africa, right? This pattern holds especially in Africa, which is a place that had a lot of personalist regimes in the early 1990s. So because Africa seemed particularly prone to replace its autocratic regimes during its own downturn in the 1990s compared to other places that did not replace their autocratic regimes during regional downturns, Geddes takes this as evidence that these personalist regimes were particularly bad at managing their spending with their spending to prop up their personalist networks as opposed to single-party or military regimes. Finally, we might expect that personalistic regimes are the least likely to transition to democracy. This is because personalist regimes die when there is an assassination or a coup, and that when there is an assassination or a coup, the personalist dictator is simply replaced by someone else who creates a new personalist dictatorship. We might expect that democratic replacements are most likely in military regimes because the military regimes are bailing out early, they're negotiating their exit, they're finding ways to turn power back over in a way that leaves them in a position of power or strength when it comes to managing their own corporate interests. Again, this is in fact what we see. 74% of military regimes that collapse transition to a democracy in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, and over 30% of military regimes that collapse transition to a stable democracy that lasts more than 10 years after the military regime leaves power. This is in stark contrast to personalistic autocracies, where only 15% of these transitions result in a democratic outcome. Okay, so this is the point where I would ask you for your feedback if we were actually in class. But what I'd like you to think about is the extent to which you're convinced not only by the logic of Geddes' theory, but by the tests that she decided to run and the data that she presented in support of this theory. If you think that Geddes is wrong, if you think that this typology of autocracies is not particularly important, or if you believe that she has the typology wrong, what explanation would you give for the fact that the observations that she chooses to present in her paper appear to be consistent with her theory? Whatever alternative theory that you decide you might want to promote, it would have to reckon with the fact that the data show what it in fact shows. Okay, thank you for bearing with all of the videos for this lecture. I hope that you guys had a great spring break, and I look forward to, oh, and good luck on the midterm. And I hope that, or I look forward to seeing you guys next week. All right.